Hey everybody, welcome back to our weekly podcast. My name is Patrick Tan, General Counsel for ChainArgos. With me as usual, our CEO, Chief Data Scientist Jonathan Reiter. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all your likes, comments, and subscribes. We got a whole bunch of comments from the last one. It's about Coinbase. People were really upset would be the correct word to use with respect to Coinbase. They posted some pretty nasty comments about Coinbase. Well, I think it's all fair.
Okay, but nobody had a problem with our character.
Oh no, none of that. Yeah, it was just more like screw Coinbase. How can Coinbase be doing stuff like that? The usual. But this week, what we're gonna talk about is the Mango Markets convictions being overturned. Doesn't mean that vacated. Sorry, overturned is not quite accurate.
One was this, but anyway. Yeah.
We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the Wyoming stablecoin. John's got all the download on that. And we'll talk about Dubai's tokenized real estate. This is interesting because I'm just back from Doha, and I happened to run into a couple of people who are in Doha and actively speaking about the tokenization of real estate, which I thought was interesting given REITs already exist, but we'll get to that. Talk me through the Mango Markets convictions being vacated.
Okay, so there were, I believe, 3 counts. 2 of them were sort of market manipulation related, and one of them was wire fraud. I think that's right.
Correct.
And
there were a lot of discussions about venue as well.
Yeah. So this is going to be a summary of that because there's a lot of fine points about all kinds of stuff.
That only lawyers care about. To be fair,
so the venue one, I guess the substance there is this was in Southern District of New York.
Yeah.
If it's going to be tried in the U.S., it's going to have to be in some part of the U.S.
The crime is supposed to have occurred in some part of the U.S.
Establish that it happened in that district and is a random single interaction with a company that's an incidental service provider sufficient to establish jurisdiction. That's a venue, whatever. That's a proper lawyer.
Yeah, the only lawyers care about this kind of stuff.
So, I mean, you can run a separate podcast. Absolutely no one will listen.
Nobody will watch.
Crypto venue. Okay, so part of the judge's conclusion was that he couldn't have committed wire fraud because the system, insofar as the part he manipulated was completely automated, there was no one to defraud. So this is an interesting take on the code is law concept in the, you mix this with the mixer discussions from earlier, how systems that are owned, immutable, whatever, can enter into contracts. Systems that are completely automated can't enter into, in a legal sense, contracts.
Yeah.
Nobody controls what's happening. So that can still constitute market manipulation, but you can't deceive a process that is completely transparent and open. And that's fair enough.
Yeah.
That's completely fair enough. You could argue that he deceived effectively the DAO, and then the defense would be, I didn't deceive the DAO, because the DAO is a thing, right? It has a name. But then the defense would partially for that one be, well, it's not the DAO I deceived, it's this transparent, they published an open set of rules, and it just all followed those rules, and you can charge me with manipulating those rules, which he, did. Stylistically, he definitely did.
Yeah.
Legally. So it's an interesting place to kind of draw the line there. I don't think this is so much of a positive result for the Code is Law group as much as a negative result for the people who'd like to be able to manipulate these systems. The finding was also clearly that you can market manipulate even if everything's following the rules. Now, that has to be retried for all kinds of other reasons.
Yeah,
who knows?
That have nothing to do with...
and he's already in prison for completely unrelated child pornography-related stuff, so who knows what's going to... The case is very strange. But it was very interesting to see that, and this does make sense logically, right? That you can't wire fraud, you can't deceive, fraud. There can't be deception if the thing you're transacting with is completely mechanical and automated, but that you absolutely can market manipulate a thing that's completely okay. That's a place to draw a line that not just lawyers care about, I suppose. It's extremely unclear if anyone will appeal or relitigate or retry or whatever any of the pieces that can be, because again, he's already in prison for completely unrelated stuff.
And that unrelated stuff will keep him there for a while.
Yeah,
that this stuff kind of like.
Yeah, I mean, it's normally wire fraud that can stack into ridiculously long sentences, and not the other market manipulation stuff. So
none of this stuff is perhaps as that people would take issue with as much as the other stuff.
There are all kinds of interesting legal questions around child pornography in general, but that's not the subject of this podcast. Some of them are vaguely related to some of the crypto sorts of, anyway, we can do a podcast someday on whether or not generative AI for child pornography is a positive or negative. It's a fascinating.
That's a tough one.
They're fascinating questions.
That's tough. I do think that the one takeaway that maybe people might want to think about in terms of the the appropriate forum to bring these sort of prosecutions in. It, not to say that this is right or wrong, but I think you have to draw the line somewhere, and the idea that you can't, that where the commission of the act is not, where there's no clear nexus with the United States, and especially the district that you're bringing the suit in, the prosecution in, you could in some ways kind of get away with it.
Well, yeah, I also I suspect that will simply change the way that the prosecutors look at things, try to find more U.S. domiciled victims who, because if it's a market manipulation thing, it's a loss of manipulation, it would change the way that you approach that. Here, they've really tried to do, there's a number of cases where there have been extremely tenuous connections to the United States that kind of looks, you could look at it as a cynic and say that this was just sloppy or lazy.
Yeah.
You could also look at it, I guess this is the perspective of people who've done this for a long time. This has historically been sufficient, so why would we expend more resources? And that's completely fair enough. The bar for resources is now going to have to go up, because you can't just say incidental random service provider single transaction. Which, okay, the bar has to be somewhere.
And also in terms of even when it came to the victims, they had this, to be fair to Eisenberg, there wasn't in this case there wasn't that clear link to the victim, and the victim being in the United States.
I mean, that's true. But he was also physically in, I believe, Puerto Rico at the time.
Yeah.
So on some sense, the whole thing is much ado about nothing, because they could simply try it in a different district, and
that's
it would
right.
be fine.
Yeah,
so
that was
it changes the rules, but doesn't change the outcome.
Depending on who you are, you may or may not see the Puerto Rico as part of the United States.
Well,
so
okay,
the people have differing views on that.
This podcast is way off topic.
Okay, anyway, let's move on. Wyoming stablecoin,
Yes,
which
okay.
is definitely a part of the United States.
Yeah. Okay, so Wyoming has got an official state stablecoin project. It's quite far along. They've selected a whole bunch of service providers, and the rest of it, they're going to use a whole bunch of different blockchains, and there's a whole bunch of politicking around that. I don't know that we talked about this at the time, but there's just arguments about various blockchains complaining that they were not in their process and how the process worked and the rest of it. So the code is all out there for their token. There's nothing special about the token or any of those things. So the part that I find most interesting is the way that they're approaching compliance. So not from an AML perspective, but so they're using a layer 0 product called Precrime to do their compliance. And this is particularly interesting because the state, the extent to which this thing is a state licensed and state issued product, it will be pretty much exclusively Wyoming state law that controls here, right? It's a government issued thing operating by the government, whatever. So normally that stuff isn't subject to other parts of the world. I mean, theft, but the regulations will be Wyoming only. So the way that the layer 0 pre-crime system works is interesting. It sounds clever, and then when you think about it, you realize maybe it's not such a great idea. So when you propose a transaction through a bridge, whatever, through any generic complex operation, it kind of forks the system, and it runs your transaction on a little private simulated copy of the blockchain, and then it checks afterwards a whole bunch of invariants. You specify in advance a whole bunch of things to check afterwards that aren't supposed to change. So if you're thinking about this as like a bridge exploit, and you have a bridge and you're going to use pre-crime to prevent issues with the bridge, you're going to make sure that no more than the expected number of tokens were emitted or consumed by the bridge. Okay. And that sounds like it works until you remember that these transactions can deploy arbitrary code, and you can stack them over time, right? So if you make one of the invariants no code was deployed, you no longer have a programmable system. So that can't be one of your invariants.
Yeah.
Right. So the invariant has to be code can be deployed, and it has to be sort of arbitrary code, because again, if you're only going to require code that is open source and published by certain people, it's not a programmable, permissionless, whatever system. Okay. So now over time, I can stack as much fresh code as I want, and now instead of did the bridge emit more tokens than were expected, you could have something akin to, did I manage to trick a wrapped token that I just created into emitting more wrapped versions of it, right? And then you'd have to add an invariant to stop that, and then I can find another route and find another route. And because I can stack transactions, as long as they don't violate the invariant, they'll all go through. So this doesn't work in the limit. It just changes the complexity of the attacks.
Yeah.
Fine. None of that is new. We've done academic.
You've written a paper about that.
This goes back to the DAO hack and people recognizing that you couldn't pre-screen from. Okay. Now, What's interesting is if the state of Wyoming says this pre-crime thing, right? If stuff isn't stopped by the pre-crime thing, it's good. Then you have the state, the ultimate legal authority for the product, declaring that if you can evade the pre-crime invariance, it's not a crime. That is interesting, right? Because if you're a financial institution operating under some strict liability regulation, the government can always go back and decide you didn't do it right.
But the kibosh on
that's
you.
the way this stuff works.
Yeah.
But the state, you can go in and say, no, the state promised me in writing that if I got through pre-crime screening, that my transaction is good. The judge is going to say, yeah, you're good, right? That should be a pretty airtight defense. Again, as long as you...
This is not legal advice, but yes.
Well, ref the Mango Market stuff, as long as you don't make public statements that your intent was to exploit this problem.
That could be inconvenient.
That may or may not work, but
that
if
could
you
be
really make it clear that you're planning on simply, these are the way you're building your thing, and that should be pretty good, because they are stating precisely the things that are illegal as a list of invariants. And if that's the way that this is phrased, it is the way the draft rules are written at the moment, then yeah, it will be the first attempt at building a legal system where ex post enforcement is not possible, and people who find what are in advance obvious loopholes can exploit them at will.
Technically, that's the civil law system.
Well, sort of. I mean, the government can usually still find a way to... The problem here is that they will have a sequence of publicly executed checks all approving something, and then coming back afterwards and saying, yeah, but we didn't really mean that was okay. If there's a decision to go that way, that will make the whole thing fall apart.
So you get the ladies, in the hot tub with the thing connected to their heads.
I assume that they're calling it pre-crime as a reference to that movie. I don't know that it was a hot tub. Doesn't really matter. So that was it. That was, I thought, interesting that they're really pushing that one by using. Yeah, the pre-crime thing sounds smart, and then you realize you can't write the invariance. So you can block the problems that have already happened. All over the world, people complain about how regulators focus on fixing the last problem. Here you're codifying it, and you're removing discretion to fix sort of creative approaches to attacking it.
That is literally the plot of Minority Report.
Well, I don't know that they have more than one validator and that they can have a minority report. I'm not recommending anyone watch that movie, but anyway.
Dubai Tokenized Real Estate.
So this one's fascinating. So this is a project, and it openly says that the initial versions aren't going to involve a blockchain or crypto. So tokenized real estate means fractional ownership of real estate, which I believe
it's called a REIT.
REITs. You can do fractional shares of fractional ownership of real estate. So whatever. The fact that technology seems marginally vacuous, I don't think is a big deal. What I thought was most interesting, so it's all happening within the virtual assets regulatory regime, whatever there, which is fine. And that essentially imposes on all of the intermediaries and operators and system things, all of whatever the standard Dubai Financial Center regulations are going to be. So if you think banking in Dubai is fine, then this is fine. And if you think banking in Dubai is not fine, then this is not fine. It's exactly the same as that, because you can transfer shares to people that have... That's it. Because there is no permissionless blockchain thing even really proposed concretely, there's no discussion of what the meaning of an unknown permissionless UBO transfer of a piece of real property would be. That is a problem that will have to be addressed, but they're openly saying that problem won't occur here because we're just not allowing that to happen. So, okay. Fair enough, I suppose. I mean, you can use it for... It's not even they're using a blockchain for record keeping. They seem to be using a blockchain for branding.
That's a good brand.
Which, I mean, I think what that highlights for me is that this tokenization word, we've talked about this a few times, means two different things depending on who you're talking to. One of them is fractionalization, which this is doing. Fractionalization for real estate ownership is fine. There are many reasons why that doesn't work in all kinds of different contexts. For a very long time, there are structured real estate investments with various versions of fractionalization in continental Europe going back 400 years. Right? So very complex old structures. France, for example, for a very long time, Napoleonic Code, a lot of inheritance is mandatory split among all the children. So you'll have a piece of property that's owned by, what the joke is, 300 relatives that never speak and don't like each other. Right? They collectively own one house because that's the way that inheritance works. So there are various mechanisms for fractional ownership like that forever. The other thing tokenization means is often, permissionless transfer enabled by a permissionless blockchain. And since that's not happening here, I guess all they can really mean is fractional ownership, which I'm sure there are plenty of people who will sell you a share in a Dubai apartment for a long time.
Yes.
I remember ads from, long
That
time
has not
ago.
changed.
That has not changed. Yeah. So, I mean, have a good time. That may well be more efficient. No idea. I mean, property transactions can be a lot of paperwork, but then REIT transactions are not a lot of paperwork. So, the pitch for interactive brokers, it's no problem. Just trade the stupid REIT shares. And everybody's got fractional shares now, so I don't really get
Maybe you want
that.
a share not of a shopping mall, but you want a share of like 53 Chester Lane.
I mean, what was the So you were in Doha, which is not Dubai, but similar blockchain focus on whatever developing financial market stuff. What was the buzz around this? People were trying to understand how to do this, or
Well, if I want to be really cynical about it, the obvious reason that anybody would want to tokenize real estate is to provide access to the same people who couldn't buy this real estate in their own names. And
that's just a
the
question
only,
of the banking system quality.
Correct.
Which good, bad, whatever.
I'm not passing
yeah,
judgment
yeah.
on that. And that was really straightforward, and that was what somebody told me away from the more public areas. Because my thought was, why would anybody? I mean, like, even if you were to look at tokenization, that seems to be like the most politically charged, emotionally charged asset you could try to tokenize, and it'd be the most problematic from legal, tax, and a whole bunch of issues.
I hadn't even thought about how. I assume they have
How would
property
you
taxes of some sort.
Well, I'm not
know.
Dubai. I'm not sure,
I
but
don't know.
yeah, I honestly don't know about the UAE. But in other jurisdictions and stuff like that, and even things like stamp duty and stuff like that, you're trying to tokenize something that is incredibly complicated. Tokenize in this case meaning fractionalized as well.
Yeah,
There's a reason why REITs exist, because they're these huge monolithic.
Yeah, I mean, the issue there is that the maintenance costs, not just physical, but the financial maintenance costs, paying the property taxes on those property. And whether or not the UAE has what would be called property tax, there are unquestionably fees associated with the maintenance
of course,
that have to be run through and somebody has to pay those. And if the property generates enough cash that you can pay those things out of the cash flows, you could argue maybe that happens kind of in the box and never touches the UBO. But for properties that don't do that, there's no guarantee these things will generate cash, right? Then someone has to go in and
Who's going to carry the can?
I mean, imagine if you're tokenize a vacant house.
Hey.
Someone has to pay the.
Who's going to carry the can? And
who do you come to when it hasn't been paid and the rest of it?
I mean, I don't know how it works in Dubai, but presumably there are council fees.
There clearly are costs. Even if it's only clean in compliance with the zoning and electricity and whatever, but there's definitely costs.
There are costs associated with the real estate.
All the land registry cares about is making sure they know who's on the hook if somebody doesn't pay to come collect, because they have to take action to seize the property from you if you don't pay, and that's the land registry's job everywhere in the world. So while that sounds like an obscure problem to an individual buying a house, it's the core competence of the land registry everywhere in the world.
This is why REITs are massive, and
commercial property is much messier to run, but
correct.
Yes.
But the idea of getting a whole bunch of council houses and then tokenizing them, to me was, I mean, the first question I asked was, why are we doing this?
What's the purpose of adding the blockchain part? But here they're not adding the blockchain part, so the answer is,
there you go, mission accomplished.
Don't worry about it,
yeah. So.
To get that joke back in, I'm impressed.
All right, and on that note, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all your comments, likes, and subscribes. We appreciate it, and appreciate you for tuning in, and we will see you again next week. Bye bye.